Hello, welcome to the Madrona Group's 15-minute forms. Today, we're going to talk about a specific form and we're just going to dive into some of the important details about it. And today, we're going to talk about Form 35R. So, Form 35R is the form that we use in response to our inspection contingency, Form 35. So, when we respond to an inspection, we want to do it in a way that follows the guidelines from our inspection contingency, and that does so with 35R. This is the form in its entirety. So, you can see there are 3 spaces. This is also the place where we get to negotiate repairs. And each one of these places has a timeline that we need to follow based on what our Form 35 says we have. For the purpose of today, I'm going to go off of what the boilerplate language says and hold that timeline to 3 days each. So the first paragraph is the first part that your buyer gets to go back and respond to their inspection. There are 4 different options. We have the buyer's approval of the inspection, which means if the buyer checks that box, the contingency is satisfied and you will move to closing. The second option is going to be that the buyer disapproves of the inspection. The buyer is terminating the contract and the earnest money is going to be given back to the buyer. The last 2 options are where we'll find ourselves using the remaining parts of these forms. So the third option says that the buyer gives notice of additional inspections. Now, if the buyer is doing an inspection and perhaps that inspector thinks that there's something wrong that is outside the scope of their expertise, they're going to note that in the inspection report and make a note that says additional inspections required. When they do that, the buyer is awarded with no need for approval from the seller to get the extra days allotted from the Form 35. Boilerplate says it's 5 days. So if you have an inspector say that there's a problem with the electrical and it needs to be additionally inspected, you can check that box, and having that information from that inspector allows your buyer to do so without additional approval from the seller. If you do select that box, make sure that you are in fact hiring a licensed inspector who calls out those additional repairs, and make sure you have ready, just in case it's asked for, the proof that inspector did call out the need for those additional repairs. The fourth option at the bottom is the request for the repairs based on the inspection that was performed. If this box is checked, you're going to go ahead and note those repairs that you want to have done in the paragraph space below. Now, this is all about timelines. So this form, I really wanted to focus not necessarily on what to write in those places, but how to navigate through those timelines. Now, once you submit this over to the seller has 3 days to consider what the buyer has delivered to them. So let's start by saying that this inspection response was delivered to the seller on April 1st. If the buyer delivered this to the seller on April 1st, if the seller has 3 days to respond to that form that the buyer sent over, what day would that put us at? Because it's less than 5 days, we're going to go by business days. So when the seller receives that, the seller has 3 days to respond. 3 days would end us on Friday the 4th. Now, once the seller does respond, they use paragraph 2. The seller has several options that they can use as their response. The first one is they can agree to the repairs that were listed above. And if the seller agrees to do, everybody moves forward towards closing and that contingency timeline has been waived or satisfied. The second option is that the seller may choose to correct only a portion of what was requested. If that happens, the seller is going to list those repairs that they're willing to do in this space here. Now, keep in mind, these spaces provided are very limited. So if this is something that requires more space than what's provided here, please attach a Form 34. And when you note this additional inspection, or when you note the need for repairs, make sure you reference the Form 34 that is going to coincide with this form. The third option is the seller could just say, no, I'm going to reject the requests that were made from the buyer, and buyer, this is where I stand. And then finally, the seller can provide an alternative solution. These alternative solutions can be repairs, they can be price reductions. So if it is not previously requested, the seller can make a different request or modification and send that back to the buyer. Now, according to the Form 35, this paragraph response, once delivered to the buyer, has also 3 days for the buyer to make their decision. If the buyer does, once the buyer receives that, the buyer's 3 days will be over, in our case, on Wednesday the 9th. So the buyer receives the inspection response on Friday. 3 business days would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday the 9th. Now, we do have an inspection contingency period. Now, the inspection contingency needs to have the first response done by the time that the inspection contingency is over. But once the buyer is delivered the seller's response, we have 3 days for that buyer and seller to come to an agreement for whatever needs to be done. There are options in paragraph 3. If you ever find yourself making it to paragraph 3, please understand that once you receive that seller's response, you only have a limited amount of time until the buyer has to make a decision. If the buyer and seller cannot come to an agreement by paragraph 3, then the contingency is going to be waived. The buyer will not get any repairs that were requested, and the buyer is going to end up closing without the protection of that contingency. There are several options in paragraph 3 that you could come to an agreement with. The buyer could just say, okay, I'm going to accept what the seller has to say. That's option 1. The buyer can reject and terminate the contract if the buyer chooses. Or during this 3-day time period of response back to the buyer, the two buyer and sellers can come to an agreement of something completely different. Now, if by paragraph 3, you're negotiating a different outcome, make sure you do in fact attach a Form 34 that shows what those agreed terms are. Because by checking the box here, you're saying that you are going to propose the alternative modification or repair. Now, strategically, you can have this negotiated ahead of time, or you can have it done at the same time you turn this in. But regardless of when that happens, by the 3rd day, after the buyer has received the response from the seller, a decision must be made to either move forward in the contract or to terminate. So just make sure that by that 3rd box, you have everything in place that you need. The 2nd box was delivered April 9th. So per the Form 35, the buyer would have the boilerplate language 3 days to respond to that. Make sure that you're keeping your buyer in check as far as those dates are concerned, because remember, if no decision has been made by the last day available for that 3rd paragraph, your buyer will be moving on towards closing with no modifications or repairs, since none of them have been agreed in paragraphs 1 or 2. I hope that this was able to shed a little bit of light on the confusion of paragraph 3. And if you have any questions about timing or the 3rd paragraph, please reach out to your managing broker or your designated broker. Thank you.